You know, it's wrong to tell people what they should do. But what about if you're telling people that they shouldn't be telling people what people should be doing? That kind of makes you think, doesn't it? Dear friends, welcome back. Now, I've shared before how I started college with all the wide-eyed enthusiasm that a new English major could muster. I knew that I wanted to write, I knew that I wanted to learn more about the English language, and I was just so eager to get started. But unfortunately, I soon realized that an English major was mostly going to mean taking classes about old books and trying to wrap my head around all the Brooks, Bart, and Derrida my professors dared to throw at first-year college students. And of course, with only the most collegial of shade for my friends who teach literature, that just wasn't for me. What I wanted was to learn how sentences worked, how writers plucked words from the ether and put them on paper. Really, my goal was to learn how to write, not how to critique literature through a post-structuralist lens. So, when I returned to school for my second year, I returned with a new major, English linguistics. It was a major that was focused on words and sentences and etymologies. Finally, I was taking classes that were teaching me the things that I wanted to learn. But while I was learning about syntax, semantics, pragmatics, morphology, and even my own favorite, phonetics, my education in linguistics also involved an education in a fundamental approach to the study of language known as descriptivism. Modern linguistics, as I was taught, is the scientific study of language. Where scientists might observe the growth of plants, motion of particles, or behavior of fish, linguists employ their methods to describe how language works. And that's really the key. Marine biologists don't write articles saying what whales should do. They describe what whales actually do. Physicists don't usually say that electrons should move in a particular way. They conduct tests in order to describe how electrons actually do move. And linguistics aren't really interested in telling us how a word should be pronounced. They're interested in describing the ways that people do pronounce a word. Describing how people use language is the fundamental aim of studying language scientifically. Finding systematic explanations for how people build sentences or come up with new words or change their speaking style when they're at home or on the job is the goal. And linguistics do that by interviewing people, recording speech samples, analyzing text, doing surveys, and more. The goal is to understand how language works and how people use it. And in that case, the valuable results are the ones that accurately reflect actual usage. And if you take an intro linguistics course, you'll probably hear about how this descriptivist approach differs from a prescriptivist one. And you'll probably also be treated to all the nonsensical havoc that prescriptivists have wreaked on the English language. For example, prescriptivists invented a rule that you just can't end a sentence with a preposition. And that's not because nobody will understand you if you ask, who should I give this to, instead of to whom shall I give this? But it's because ending a sentence with a preposition isn't grammatical in Latin, and people thought silly little English would just sound so much better if only it sounded a little more like venerable old Latin. Or maybe you've heard the rule that you shouldn't use double negatives. Of course, nobody will really believe you're flush with lemons if you say you don't have none, but some uptight pedant with a little schooling in formal logic decided that not having none meant that you did in fact have some. Because, after all, sentences are multiplication problems, and the negatives cancel each other out to become positive. And we could keep going, but you get the idea. My introduction to linguistics involved a tour of all the silly, inconsistent, and pedantic ways that prescriptivists said that language should be used, often under the threat of not being perceived as some part of a prestigious in-group. In those classes, I learned that prescriptivism was foolish, controlling, and often based on the whims and preferences of people rather than actual data. You ain't supposed to say ain't more than 3 times a day, a prescriptivist might say, because it just ain't right. Never mind that people do use that word all the time, so prepare to have a meltdown when they add ain't to the dictionary and summarily desecrate the language. So, in short, linguistics is descriptivist. It's a scientific endeavor to describe how people really use language. It just doesn't care where you put your prepositions, so long as it can learn why you put them in certain places. And while your English teacher might make a big deal about whether you say can or may, a linguist doesn't really have an opinion. They just want to know what you actually say. And as a new linguistics student, I loved it all. There was a certain pleasure to showing up to class to hear my professor shred those arbitrary rules that I had grown up learning in order to show us how language really worked. And still, I'm pretty much fully on board with the value of descriptivism. When people find out that I'm an English professor, they almost always say that they'll be careful about what they say around me, or that they're extra self-conscious about emailing me because they're afraid that I'll correct or judge them. But what they don't know is that I was trained first to think like a linguist. I'm just not interested in judging anyone. I'm fascinated really in seeing how people use language. So there is no judgment with descriptivism, just objective description. But you may also find that lessons in descriptivism often go a bit beyond training in responsible scientific methodology and may slip, as, well, so many academic discussions often do, into just a little bit of self-congratulation. See, if you're a descriptivist, you're not just someone who studies language in a particular way, you're probably also an open-minded, non-judgmental, enlightened person. You're not fooled by those traditional rules. No, you're rational, clear-thinking, data-driven, and freed from outmoded social dogma, all thanks to your scientific training. And you kind of hate to say it, because descriptivism is all about rejecting hierarchies and judgments, but you're probably a better person than those petty, wrong-headed prescriptivists. So at the time, not only was I learning interesting things, but I also found descriptivism to be a pretty flattering approach. Yeah, because I was learning descriptivism, I was not only smarter than most people, but probably also more ethical and generous. And, once you reach that point, you're not far from using the words prescriptive and prescriptivist to condemn people who indulge in thoroughly unscientific offenses. Now, of course, we are having a little bit of fun with this, but there's a more important point to be made here. I certainly embraced the descriptivist approach when I learned it, and it remains an important part of how I think about language and writing, but there's a real danger sometimes of overgeneralizing and thinking that something you know applies beyond its limits. Sometimes, when we've become attached to a particular discipline or way of thinking, it can be hard to see that it does in fact have its limits. For example, I've heard neuroscientists say that psychology is good for nothing because psychologists work with unreliable human subjects in order to infer what's going on in the brain. But I've also heard psychologists say that neuroscience isn't worth much because their sample sizes are way too small to be good for anything. And then I've heard analytic philosophers dismiss continental philosophers, and I've heard of physicists talking ill of engineers, and we could keep going, but you've probably seen this before too. Of course, the one exception is rhetoric, which is a complete and perfect discipline with valuable insights to offer in relation to all things. But every other way of producing knowledge has its limitations. So yes, descriptivism is an excellent tool for the scientific study of language. If you want to find out how different groups of people use language, you couldn't do any better than to show up with a methodology tuned to describing usage patterns. But on some level, if your goal is to teach someone how to write a linguistic research article, a purely descriptive approach would pretty much be a dereliction of duty. So let's imagine for a second writing an introduction to your research article. Then your teacher returns it to you with a description of what your introduction has done. Maybe something like, this introduction begins with a quotation from Shakespeare and summarizes the findings of several previous studies. Now, tell me, how much do you really learn from that? For a bare description of your introduction to be helpful for teaching, you would have to know a good deal about how introductions work and what they should or shouldn't be doing to be successful already. An inexperienced writer might read a descriptive comment like that and say, okay, cool, my intro does do those things. But now if I got that comment after years of writing and grading introductions myself, I would say, oh no, I have an emergency on my hands. My introduction just really isn't doing what it needs to do. And now what should an introduction to a research article do? Well, generally, an introduction should establish the territory of a study, usually by saying why a topic matters and reviewing previous research. It should establish a niche, usually by pointing out what we still don't know, and then it should occupy that niche, often by describing the purpose and structure of the research project. Bah, you might say, you lousy prescriptivist, how dare you tell me what my introduction should or shouldn't do? What gives you the right to tell anyone how they should be writing? Well, my belligerent friend, I am prescribing an outline for your introduction. And honestly, most writing teachers would probably recommend the exact same outline. But that's because John Swales conducted a highly influential study in which he gathered introductions to research articles from across disciplines and described how they worked. And well, what do you know? Swales found that article introductions overwhelmingly followed a pattern of establishing a territory, narrowing to a niche, and then occupying it. Since that study was published, Swales' description of introductions has become a basic prescription for academic writers. So I guess you could dismiss it all as wrong-headed prescriptivism because it isn't as open-minded and non-directive as you might think things should be. But researching language is not the same thing as teaching writing. So it's both reasonable and necessary to use different methods for both tasks. Not only that, but this is also a very different form of prescriptivism from the silly grammar rules that you learned in high school. It's a prescription grounded in descriptivist research. It's not issuing pronouncements in spite of what writers are actually doing. It's condensing common best practices into simple advice for writers. And sure, there may be other ways to do this well, but Swales' model for introductions works so well for so many writers in so many disciplines that it just makes a lot of sense to treat it as a standard approach for writing an introduction. So sure, your descriptivist senses might tingle a little when someone says that old information should precede new information and then encourages you to rewrite your sentences to adhere to that rule. But remember that it's grounded in the uncontroversial notion that readers generally comprehend texts more easily when they can clearly see how ideas and sentences connect to each other. That's not a rule that's based on how people will judge you. It's a rule based on established knowledge about what will help people to understand what you have to say. Descriptivism is a great approach to research, and it can yield useful insights, but it is not a solution for all problems. Descriptivism has its limits, and while it can and should inform how we teach, it's not terribly useful for teaching just by itself. Simply telling someone what they have done usually is not enough to show them how to do it better. And, well, if you don't believe that, go ahead and check the research. Among modern rhetorical theorists, you'll often encounter a variation of the idea that science is concerned with what we know, while rhetoric is more interested in what we do. In a world where science was treated as the ultimate and only means of finding truth, rhetoricians of the 20th century were careful to point out that even science had its limitations. And now I get that that does sound a little controversial, but it's also just common sense. To say that is not to reject science, it's just an acknowledgement that the scientific method is really good at answering some questions and not so effective at answering others. Different disciplines continue to exist because they all answer different questions in different ways. And I tend to think of descriptivist and prescriptivist approaches to language in a similar way. They just serve different purposes. Now, obviously, idiosyncratic and arbitrary declarations about language are unhelpful, but prescriptions rooted in descriptivist understanding aren't really problematic at all. Writing teachers have had a hard time shaking the reputation of yesteryear, but the reality is that contemporary writing instruction, with all of its shoulds and should-nots, is actually founded on decades of descriptivist inquiry into how writing and writers work. Of course, we tend to do a poor job of advertising it, but the fact is that an English professor who slashes at your paper with a red pen, marks sentences awk for awkward, and focuses primarily on your commas and dangling modifiers is as out of step with the discipline as the chemist who's still trying to turn lead into gold with a philosopher's stone. But of course, in the end, a writing teacher must teach, not just describe. So a certain amount of telling you how something ought to be done is unavoidable. Beyond that, though, I also think that it's always a little healthy to practice some epistemological humility. Your preferred approach may be excellently well suited to the things you care the most about, but every discipline and methodology has its limits. And that's not something that diminishes your neuroscience, your linguistics, your continental philosophy, or even your rhetoric. It just means that different tools do different jobs, and that we find answers to different kinds of questions with correspondingly different methodologies. Prescriptivism is worthless if it's not grounded in descriptivism, and frankly, descriptivism in turn isn't good for much without being expressed in practical and responsible prescription. So I don't know, but maybe, now just maybe, we could spend less time on silly contests over which discipline or methodology has the monopoly on truth, and instead just have such a good time enjoying the fact that there are so many ways to learn and do so many cool things, whether you're a botanist, architect, musician, or poet. Now, of course, maybe that's just what a rhetorician would say, in a vain attempt to claw back some relevance in our enlightened age of descriptivist science. I suppose that's ultimately for you to decide, but either way, I'll be here next week to talk about more writing delights, and I do hope to see you then. In the meantime, as always, take good care.